Yes. Yes. Of course. Commander, of course.
Yes, sir.
Ready and waiting.
Commander, of course.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes,
Medic
sir.
reporting. Affirmative.
Commander, of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course.
Yes, sir. Agreed. Agreed. At once.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Acknowledged. Very well. Agreed.
Commander,
Yes, sir. At once.
Commander.
Unit lost.
Of course.
Unit
Of course.
lost.
Medic reporting.
Yes. Move out. Move out. Of course.
Acknowledged. Very well.
Commander.
Yes, sir. Moving out. Moving out.
Commander. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Moving out.
Yes. Of course. Move out.
Reporting. Agreed.
Medic reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Commander.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Commander. Of course. Of course.
Reporting. Awaiting order. Affirmative. Agreed.
Commander. Move out.
Reporting. At once. Yes, sir. At once. Affirmative.
Yes. Move out. Of course.
Yes, sir. Moving out. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Very well.
Reporting. At once.
Commander. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of
Unit
course.
lost.
Of course. Move out.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Medic
Moving out.
reporting.
Yes. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Very well. Acknowledged. Very well. At once. Affirmative.
Reporting. Agreed. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Very well.
Commander. Of course.
Acknowledged. At once. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative.
Yes. Move out.
Acknowledged. Very well.
Commander. Of course.
Unit lost.
Move out. Of course. Of course.
Unit lost.
Of course.
Awaiting order. Agreed. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Commander.
Acknowledged. Agreed.
Yes. Move out.
Yes, sir. At once. At once. Yes, sir. At once. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Awaiting order. Agreed.
Commander. Of course. Move out.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out.
Unit
Of
firepower
course.
upgraded.
Move out. Of course.
Unit
Yes, sir. Very well.
armor
Affirmative.
upgraded.
At once. Very well. Yes, sir. At once. Affirmative.
Yes. Move out. Of course.
Awaiting orders. Very well. Affirmative. Reporting. Agreed. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative.
Commander. Of course.
Ready and waiting. At once.
Commander. Of course. Move out. Of course.
Ready and agreed.
Reporting. Agreed.
Acknowledged. At once.
Yes. Of course.
Yes, sir. At once.
Yes. Move out.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Acknowledged. Very well.
Yes. Of course.
Reporting. At once. Affirmative.
Commander. Move out.
Ready and waiting.
Commander. Move out. Move out. Of course. Move out.
Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. At once. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Yes. Move out.
Ready and waiting. Agreed.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. At once. Very well. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Very well. At once. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Yes. Move out.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Awaiting orders.
Commander.
Yes, sir. At once. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Of course. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. At once. Very well. Ready and waiting. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. 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 Very well.
Yes.
Ready and waiting. Very well. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. Yes, sir. At once. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. 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 Very well. Yes, sir?
Unit lost.
Acknowledged. Very well. Affirmative. Reporting. Agreed. At once. Very well. Very well. At once.
Commander? Of course.
Move out. Reporting. Agreed. Affirmative. At
Commander?
once.
Of course.
Yes, sir. Agreed.
Yes, of course.
Yes, sir? Agreed.
Commander? Of course.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Commander? Of course.
Awaiting orders. Agreed.
Yes. Of course.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Commander? Move out. Of course.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Of course. Agreed.
Commander? Of
Move
course. Of course.
Move out.
Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Very well. At once. Affirmative. Very well. Yes, sir. Affirmative. At once. Very well. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. 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 At once. Very well.
Reporting.
Commander? Of course. Move out. Of course.
Reporting.
Yes. Move out.
Yes, sir?
Ready and waiting.
Yes.
Move
Of
out.
course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Yes. Of course. Of course. Commander, move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Commander, of course. Of course. Move out. Move out.
Ready and waiting.
Acknowledged.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. At once. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. At once. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed.
Unit
Very well.
armor
At
upgraded.
once. Very well. Very well. Affirmative. Agreed. At once. Very well. Affirmative. At once. Yes, sir. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. At once. At once. Affirmative. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. Affirmative. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. At once. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. At once. Affirmative. Very well. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. 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 Very well. At once. Affirmative. Very well.
Reinforcements have
Agreed.
arrived.
Very well. Agreed.
Reinforcements
Agreed.
have arrived.
Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Agreed. Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir? Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir?
Yes. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged.
Yes. Of course.
Yes, sir.
Reporting. Affirmative. Agreed.
Yes, sir? Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Very well. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Agreed. At once. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. At once.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir? At once. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. Very well. At once. Agreed. Affirmative. 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 Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. Very well. At once.
Reporting. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Yes, sir. At once.
Yes, sir?
Acknowledged. At once. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting. Very well. At once. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders.
Awaiting orders.
Very well.
Unit
Agreed.
lost.
Awaiting orders. At once. Affirmative.
Reporting. Agreed. At once. Affirmative. Agreed. Yes, sir.
Unit
At once.
lost.
Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Ready
Yes,
and
sir.
waiting.
Very well.
Affirmative.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. At once. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. At once. Reporting. Agreed. Affirmative. Affirmative. At once.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Very well.
Yes, sir. Agreed. At once. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. At once. Very well. Agreed. Acknowledged. At once. Reporting. At once. Affirmative. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed.
Acknowledged.
Ready and waiting. Very well. Reporting. At once. Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Very well. Very well. Agreed. At once. Very well. At once. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. At once. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. At once. Very well. Affirmative. At once. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. At once.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Agreed. Affirmative.
Reporting. Agreed.
Yes, sir. Very well. Very well.
Reporting.
Reporting. Affirmative. Ready and very waiting. Well. Agreed. Yes, sir. Ready and agreed. Waiting. At once. Affirmative. Affirmative. Agreed. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Very well. Reporting. Very well. Very well. Affirmative. 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 At once. Affirmative. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. Agreed. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Very well. At once. Affirmative. At once.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Very well. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. At once. Affirmative.
Acknowledged. Agreed. Affirmative.
Commander?
Vehicle reporting. Ready and waiting.
Agreed. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. 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 At once. Awaiting orders.
Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Ready and waiting. Agreed. Awaiting orders. Affirmative. Agreed.
Yes, of course.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Agreed.
Commander, move out. Commander? Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Move out. Move out. Of course. Move out.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Very well. Agreed. Very well.
Acknowledged. Very well.
Yes, of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course.
Unit lost.
Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course.
Yes, sir. At once.
Medic reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Medic reporting.
Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged. At once.
Ready and agreed. At once.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Medic reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Reporting. At once.
Vehicle. Acknowledged. Reporting. Agreed. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Awaiting order. Affirmative.
Medic reporting. Medic reporting.
Acknowledged. At once. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Very well. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative.
Vehicle. Reporting.
Awaiting orders. Agreed. Very well. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Very well. At once. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Ready
yes,
and
sir.
waiting.
Agreed. Acknowledged. At once. Reporting. Very well.
Yes, of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Move out. Of course.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Agreed.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Very well.
Reporting. At once. Ready and waiting. Affirmative.
Yes, of course. Of course.
Unit
Of
lost.
course. Move out. Commander? Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Acknowledged.
Yes. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Move out. Move out. Of course.
Medic reporting.
Reporting. Agreed. Very well.
Commander? Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Move out. Of course. Move out.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Yes. Move out.
Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Acknowledged. Very well. Affirmative. Reporting. Very well. Ready and waiting. At once.
Reporting. Agreed. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Commander? Of course.
Reporting. Agreed.
Commander? Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course.
Unit lost.
Reporting. Affirmative. At once.
Commander? Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Very well.
Ready and waiting. At once.
Medic reporting. Affirmative. Moving out. Affirmative.
Yes. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course.
Reporting. Affirmative. Very well. Affirmative. Agreed.
Commander, move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course.
Ready and waiting. Agreed. At once.
Commander, of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Move out. Move out. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Awaiting orders. Agreed.
Commander, move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out.
Ready and waiting.
Affirmative.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Reporting at once. Agreed.
Medic reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Agreed. Yes, sir. Very well. Agreed. Agreed.
Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Commander,
Acknowledge. At once. Agreed. At once.
Commander, of course.
Reporting. Affirmative. At once.
Commander,
Lost.
of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Commander, move out. Move out.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes. Of course. Yes. Move out. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative. Reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Medic
Yes, sir.
reporting. Moving out.
Yes. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Very well.
Commander, of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Move out.
Vehicle. Affirmative.
Yes. Of course. Of course.
Acknowledged. Very well. Awaiting order. Acknowledged.
Commander, move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Yes. Of course.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. At once.
Reporting. At
Ready
once.
and waiting.
Yes. Of course.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course.
Vehicle. Affirmative.
Yes. Of course.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes. Of course. Move out. Of course.
Medic reporting. Affirmative.
Yes. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out.
Vehicle. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Moving out.
Yes. Move out. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Move out.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle. Reporting. Yes, sir. Very well. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course.
Vehicle. Acknowledged. Reporting. Agreed. Agreed. Reporting. Affirmative. Reporting. Agreed. Agreed. Ready and waiting. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Awaiting orders.
Awaiting orders.
Acknowledged. Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Ready.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Agreed.
At once. Medic reporting out.
Reporting. Awaiting orders. At once.
Commander?
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Reporting.
Yes.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged.
Commander? Of course. 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 Of course.
Unit
Of
lost.
course.
Ready and waiting. Affirmative.
Commander? Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Of course. Move out. Of course. Of course. Of course.
Acknowledged. Very well. Affirmative. Very well.
Yes. Of course.
Agreed. At once. Agreed. Affirmative. Very well.
Mission accomplished.